bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the August 20th, 2024 podcast. As those of you watching on YouTube can see, my guest today is my partner, Brad Elphick, the head of our Novogradac New Markets Tax Credit Working Group, and one of Novogradac's leading new market tax credit experts. The focus of this week's podcast is a major recent announcement by the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, or CDFI Fund. The announcement was made last month on July 15th, wherein, via email, they announced that they plan to combine the calendar year 2024 and 2025 new market tax credit issuance authorities into one single allocation round. This July 15th announcement sets the stage for the largest single allocation authority round in the 24-year history of the new markets tax credit. The round size will be $10 billion. This $10 billion represents the calendar year allocation authority for 2024 of $5 billion, and 2025 of a similar amount of $5 billion. The CDFI Fund announcement of combining rounds comes while we await the awards announcement for the current 2023 round of $5 billion. It's expected that the opening of the application round for the $10 billion will follow the 2024 awards announcement of the 2023 round. I'll give Brad's thoughts as to when he expects the 2023 awards announcements to be made and when the 2024 round might open. Now, Brad has been a guest on this podcast many times. In fact, this is his 14th appearance, including last week's podcast when he was one of 3 guests. And Brad was also a guest host earlier this summer on an episode that was part of our Renewable Energy Project Finance series. Now, in today's episode, Brad and I will discuss some questions we've been getting from clients about the range of possible effects of the double round of new markets tax credit allocation. We'll also review some of what CDEs and qualified businesses seeking subsidized NMTC financing that they should be doing now in anticipation of this coming double round. All that said, I wanted to share a bit more background that led up to the double round. The new market tax credit statute was last extended back on December 27, 2020. Net extension was for 5 years at $5 billion in new markets tax credit authority per year through the year 2025. However, delays in the allocation process over the past several years have compounded such that allocation awards are being made in the year after the year for which they're authorized. And this year is a good example, August 2024, and we're getting ready for the calendar year 2023 award to be announced. You might be wondering, when was the last time the allocation was announced in the year for which it was authorized? That was back in 2016, which also happened to be a double round 2015 and 2016 allocation of $7 billion. And one of the purposes of the decision by the CDFI Fund to combine rounds this time, which Brad and the new market tax credit working group did encourage, was to get the allocations back on schedule. To that end, in terms of the encouragement of Brad and the new market tax credit working group, we did send a letter to the CDFI Fund way back on February 3rd of 2023, recommending combining rounds. And the new market tax credit working group wasn't alone with this recommendation. Later last year, a group of congressional leaders also sent a letter asking for the CDFI Fund to find a way, and I quote, to ensure that all authorized allocations are dispersed by the end of 2025. Well, all of that as background, or with all of that as background, you can see we have a lot to cover today. So if you're ready, let's get started. Brad, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. It feels like I was just here.
Only because you were.
Right.
Before we get into today's discussion, I wanted you to take a moment to share with our listeners and viewers a brief description of some of the many services you provide to Novogradac clients.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And for those that haven't heard the last 13 times, I do provide a lot of services, mainly in the low-income housing tax credit, new markets tax credits, and historic tax credit incentives. Includes traditional accounting services, audits, tax returns, as well as transaction consulting services. In addition to the accounting side, as Mike mentioned, I'm also the host of the New Market Tax Credit Working Group. We're a very august group of new market tax credit stakeholders and participants who are very active in the new market tax credit incentive and work to find ways to make the incentive even more effective. And we've been very active, as Mike said, and part of that relates to our topic today, related to the combined $10 billion round. So, looking forward to talking about that and everything that might bring for all of us in the future.
Well, thank you for that, Brad. And thanks for your leadership with the New Market Tax Credit Working Group, for all that you've done in the past and for all you'll be doing in the future. Now, before we discuss this combined $10 billion round, it seems only natural to start with the current 2023 round. Applications have been submitted. They're in the process of being scored or have been scored. What are you hearing as to the timing of awards announcements of those up to 2023 round?
Well, if as you said, it can get a little confusing which round we're talking about. We're in August and we're still talking about 2023. But I think part of that, obviously, as you mentioned, is that over the time period that we've been having these awards announced, it's been slipping every year. And so now we're talking about 2023 possibly being awarded in the next couple weeks or month or so. So why, do we keep asking, like, when do I think that these will be announced? Part of it's unfortunately because the CFI Fund kind of operates in a black box where we don't have this consistent time frame for when the awards will be. And so we're left to do some guessing, and I enjoy guessing, making predictions. Uh, I'm not sure I've gotten any of them exactly right yet, but I've been fairly close. And as long as I keep it in the black box, it's a little bit of job security for me. So originally, when I did this for the working group a month or so ago, I looked at the prior round, the 22 awards, and looked at the time frame or how long it took that round to be reviewed and allocated. And I said, okay, if we took some of that time frame and applied it to this 2023 round, what would that look like? And I actually was coming up with some dates in August, as early as August, I think, 9th to August 26th, if you use the same time frame as that prior round. However, we have some new intel. I'm not sure that it's going to be in August anymore. I think it's going to likely slip to September. And part of that reason is that it has something to do with the fact that the CDFI Fund, which was established under the Regal Community Development Regulatory Improvement Act, will be 30 years old. So it's the 30th anniversary of the CDFI Fund, not like our 35th anniversary, as you'll note in Mike's background there. But the CDFI Fund is celebrating an anniversary. And so there is some talk that they may make the awards around that anniversary. So the anniversary is September 23rd. Not sure it'll be that date, but we're hearing that it could be sometime in September. Unfortunately, we've also heard that it could possibly slip to October, which would be unfortunate. And one of the reasons why I say would be unfortunate if it slips, I think that as the industry was thinking about the timing for this round, it started a month earlier than the 22 round. So a lot of people were thinking the awards would come out a month earlier than last year, which happened in September as well. If the awards come out in August or early September, it gives transactions a chance to close before year end, much more so than if the awards are made in late September or even October. And a lot of that has to do with the timing that it takes to close transactions and to get allocation agreements signed. So we may see some slippage there if the awards aren't made till late September, early October, in terms of the ability to close the amount of transactions that maybe we were anticipating with an August announcement.
So I appreciate you mentioning the fact that once the awards come out, a CDE that receives an award can't the next day close up financing
Right.
because there's that document that you referenced. So maybe you could talk a bit about the allocation agreement and other interactions that a CDE has to have with the CDFI Fund in
Sure.
order to be able to use the awarded allocation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I will mention that the draft allocation agreement for the 2023 awards has actually been published on the CDFI Fund's website. We found it there after combing the website for other updates and saw that, hey, this has been released unbeknownst to anyone. And so what it allows you to do is kind of have a look at what the contract is between the CDE and the CDFI Fund if you are to receive an award. Now, in order to close on a transaction, that contract has to be executed in order to make your award final. And so CDEs typically, it's unknown whether or not they will receive an award. And so they may wait to see if they have an award and work through the allocation agreement process before they actually start closing on transactions. There are some that get ahead of that and start, and we'll talk about what CDEs can do now later. But ultimately, that document has to be signed between the CDE and the CDFI Fund. That typically involves getting your tax counsel or your legal counsel involved and ensuring that that document, because it is a legal document, is correct. So when you look at the time that it takes for the CDFI Fund to get you your specific allocation agreement, that doesn't leave you much time left to close a transaction before year end. And that's what we saw last year. Awards were made in September 20th, I think, or 22nd, somewhere around there. And we didn't see this big rush just because of the amount of time to close the transactions between when CDEs were able to get their final executed allocation agreement and year end.
Great. Thank you for that. Now let's turn to the next round, the 2024 round, which I noted. The CDFI Fund has said will include the 2024 and 2025 authorized allocation amounts of $5 billion each, for a total of $10 billion. Now, in the past few allocation rounds, there's been a relatively short period between 1 year's award announcement and the opening of the next round. So with that said as background, what's your current sense as to when the application for the 2024 double round will open? And when do you expect applications to have to be filed or submitted in order to be eligible for the next round?
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously it's a guess based upon what we're hearing and data from prior rounds. The current guess is that with the combined allocation round, the 2024-25 allocation round, that it's likely to be opened towards year end. When I hear that, I think December sometime. And I think that there's probably some factors that make that seem very plausible. One of them is that the CDFI Fund had to put out the allocation application template for public comment this year. That was put out for public comment, which the New Market Tax Credit Working Group submitted, I think, almost 40 pages of comments for them to consider to improve the application. And that had to go through a 60-day comment period. That was submitted, and the CDFI Fund has confirmed that they need to put that, once they review it and make some updates, that they will have to put it out again for another 30-day public comment period. Well, you know that hasn't happened yet, or maybe you don't know, but it hasn't. I know you do, but maybe our listeners don't know, but that hasn't happened yet. And in my mind, when we're starting to hear when the awards might be, I kind of think that they might make the award before they put that back out for a 30-day public comment period. That's just a guess on my part. So when you factor that in, you start to get closer and closer to year end, and you get kind of into that December timeframe. And the last time that the CDFI Fund opened around in December was in 2007, when it opened the calendar year 2008 round on December 28th, if you can believe it. And that had a deadline of March 5th. So that's 10 weeks between when they opened the round at the end of December and the deadline for submitting your application. Actually, the round before that was also opened in December. That was opened at the beginning of December on December 1st. And that had a deadline of February 27th, which was actually 12 weeks. Now, I have to imagine that it was longer because you had to factor in more holidays between December and year end than you would have if the round opens in December 28th. So I think in terms of my guess of when the application might be due will really depend if it's actually opened in December, of whether it's kind of beginning of December or end of December. Regardless, I think if you're in December, you're kind of in that late February, early March timeframe. And, and that's just looking back at kind of what the precedent has been in prior rounds. The application that I mentioned that we submitted comments on, there weren't tremendous amount of changes or updates to it. So I think that I think that what we should see when the application template is submitted for that 30-day comment period I mentioned will probably be as close to the final version as we can expect, which will allow people to start looking at the application at that point, kind of really saying, okay, I can work from this draft until they actually put out the actual application for the combined round.
Yeah, I assume you would agree that, once the next to final draft comes out, that's probably a good time for CDEs to start thinking about populating responses and getting a head start on the application, because it always takes longer than you think it takes.
Yeah, and I would say that a lot of CDs have already started that process. A lot of clients that we work with have already started that.
So I wanted to talk a bit more about the significance of a $10 billion round. Over the last few years, as I noted in the intro, the new market test financings, the community has gotten used to annual $5 billion rounds. But I say annual, but they're not really annuals. On average, there's more than 12. It's in the range of 12 to 14 months between rounds, which is one of the reasons why we're here now talking 23 round, and its announcements coming in the late third quarter, early fourth quarter, 2024. But as we contemplate a $10 billion round, one question that a lot of clients and prospective clients are asking me, and I know they're asking you, is how the larger round will affect the expected number of CDEs that win an award, as well as how it might affect the average award size. And being the accountant that I am, I start looking at it pretty analytically. And in order to look at it analytically, I start with, by way of reference, that recently the average award size of $5 million round has been about $50 million plus or minus. And the number of awardees has been about 100 plus or minus. So I think about taking $5 billion round to 10 billion. But I think, well, if we keep the number of awardees the same, say 100, then the math is pretty easy. Would mean the average award size is now 100 million. And then I think, okay, that's maybe one extreme. I don't think that'll happen. The other extreme is if you said, the average award size will stay the same. Then you would say, well, then you'd have to double the number of awardees and go from 100 to 200 awardees. And I don't think that'll happen either. So then I think, well, what's the middle ground? And the middle ground, kind of the in-between point, would be mathematically that you would basically have slightly more than 41% in terms of awardees. So go from say 100, 140, and then take the average award size to slightly more than 40%, to, slightly more than 70 million. And then you would have basically roughly 140 awardees at roughly 70 million. And that doesn't quite get you to 10 billion, but I want a round. I don't want to, and that's kind of, I think of as the middle spot, in terms of, awardees, if everything was percentage wise the same. And my view is that 140 to 70 seems like it's a comfortable spot, based upon, the history of allocations and the rest. What do you think about that analysis? you think about that approach and what you think in terms of the number of awardees and average award size. And this is important relevant because, this will be driven, in terms of applicants thinking, should they apply or not? They want to have a sense of what's the probability if I submit an application, I'll have success.
Yeah. Well, first of all, well said. I think that analysis is spot on in terms of it's not going to be, 200 awards, and it's probably not going to be an average award size of 50 million. I think, as you said, we're probably going to be somewhere in that middle ground. And I think that the $7 billion round that we talked about before, we saw that as well. In that round, the prior average award size was 46 million in a $3.5 billion round, and it went up to 58. So it didn't double. The number of awards did not double. They went from 76 to 120. So when you look at that, I think that in the past, at least, now not everyone that's at the CDFI Fund was there then. But I think that, it makes sense that it's probably somewhere in that middle ground, maybe 140, 150 awards, maybe 65 to 70 million average award size. Now, I will caveat that obviously I think has something to do to some interplay with the number of applications that are submitted and the quality of those applications. What we have seen recently is that the number of applications being submitted has been going down ever so slightly, but it's been hovering around that 200 application number. But the quality of those applications has really increased over time. And we've seen that in the final rank score distributions that the CDFI Fund provides in their debriefing letters. So I think that, if I had to guess, we're going to see probably more applications. And one of the reasons why I think we will see more this year than some of the other years is because the CDFI Fund has actually announced that they will make a double round. The last couple double rounds, there wasn't this announcement before to let them know that it was going to be a double round. In the 2015-16 double round, it was changed to a double round after the applications had already been submitted. So there wasn't even an opportunity for someone to go, oh, wait, there's going to be twice as much allocation this time. Maybe I'll have a better chance, a higher success rate of if I apply. This time you will have that. And so I think that you will see some new applicants. I think that maybe you will see some that maybe didn't win last year or the year before and decided, I'm not sure I want to continue submitting applications. Now look at it and go, even in the last round, the 2022 awards, 102 awards out of 197 applications won. That's a 51.78% success rate. So pretty good success rate when you think about it that way. So I think that because, for the first time in a while, the CDFI Fund has been transparent in terms of what they're going to do with the next round in terms of the amount. I think that will draw in some more applications. And so one of the other things I looked at too that I think is important for those that may be considering should I submit an application. In the last combined round where there was 7 billion, out of the 120 awards, 28 of them, or 23%, were either first-time awardees or hadn't won in the previous 3 rounds. And if you look back only 2 rounds, 40 of those awards, or 1/3 of the total awards, hadn't won in the last 2 rounds or were either first-time awardees. So there is an opportunity for those that haven't won an award recently or haven't ever won an award to really have a better chance at success in a combined round where there's likely to be 140, 150 awards. And so it really just emphasizes the benefit of applying. You can't win unless you apply. And now that we all know that it's a combined $10 billion round, the largest, as you said, I think it really is a great opportunity for those that may have sat on the sidelines in prior rounds.
No,
I think, and one other thing I was going to point out, in the last several rounds, the maximum award size was 100 million, and maximum that you could request was 100 million. Now the maximum or the highest award in the last round was 65 million. So it hasn't hit the 100 million cap that they put on it in the application. I think I can see them probably increasing that limit. And that's mainly due that they won't know how many applications that they will receive. And with it being a double round, I think that they will likely increase that cap. So for those that often apply at the maximum allowed, that will just, I think that it's probably worth planning to find more projects for your pipeline, more examples, because you'll likely be able to apply for a higher cap. So, as you're planning, that's something to think about as well.
That's a good point because you have 100 million at 5 billion of allocation authority. You can easily see how 100 goes to 125 or some other number. Just
Right.
the CDFI Fund a little more discretion as they look at the various applicants. And I appreciate your point about it's not just a numbers game about how many applications and the rest. It's really about the quality of the applications
Right.
and the need of CDEs in terms of how much allocation authority, the CDFI Fund ends up feeling comfortable awarding to a given CDE, to play key roles in determining what the average allocation amount is, as well as what the total number of awardees are. But we talk about the number of CDEs and average size and all the rest, because that's obviously relevant to all of our CDE clients and the rest in terms of assessing whether or not to apply and some of those other dynamics and business planning purposes and the like. But at the end of the day, we're focused on this because of all the businesses out there and the projects that need new market tax credit subsidized finance. And that's one of the reasons why the NMTC working group was so focused on trying to get some combined rounds. Basically, let's get the dollars out to CDEs so they can start doing all of their good work in making subsidized financing to businesses operating and serving local communities. So those businesses themselves can do the work to help those communities revitalize and provide jobs and services and the like to residents of long-term communities. So with that said, when we look at this double round, and if you look at the number of businesses that typically get new market tax credit financing every year based upon this flow of $5 billion rounds, talk to me about the impact of having a double round in terms of additional financing.
Well, no surprise. I think it will increase the amount of businesses that can ultimately be
I didn't guess
financed.
that.
And so the CDFI Fund publishes a data set with the amount of transactions that are investments are made each year. And that data set currently goes through calendar year 2022. So we have some pretty recent data. And when you look back at the last couple of years within that data set, so 2020 through 2022, the average award or average investment into a business is somewhere between $8 to $10 million, which kind of matches up with kind of what we probably felt is the average. Now we see deals much larger than that, obviously. But overall, in 2022, that was about 437 investments that were made that year, according to this data set. And so if you extrapolate, when I extrapolated that and assume the average deal size is maybe $8.5 million, that would mean about 580 or so investments. So, I'm thinking that with more allocation, you probably will see average deal size in terms of the amount of the investment go up because there's more dollars to invest in these projects. So maybe that average deal size is closer to 10 million. So maybe it's closer, to 500 to 550 investments are made, but definitely an increase. And we saw that the last time that there was a combined round, the $7 billion round, that in those 2 years following when those awards were made, there was definitely an increase in that. So it's a tremendous benefit, as you mentioned, to the projects and the businesses that are looking for allocation. The allocation is a finite resource. It's is sometimes hard to find. And now that there will be more of it, I think there will really be more opportunities for businesses to find the allocation that is needed for their projects. And so, you'll see more of them getting done.
So, thank you for that. Now, one area of trepidation for CDEs and many others with this combined randomly is investor appetite. And to what degree is their investor appetite? $10 billion in new market tax credits. And it's not really $10 billion in new market tax credits. It's $10 billion in new market tax credit issuance authority. And we know there's a 39% credit rate. So when you think about the investor appetite, it's really for 3.9 billion in tax credits. And when you think about that, you can think of, the long-term tax credit being roughly a $25 billion market. You can think of renewable energy, that there's an expectation that it's getting to be a $50 billion sort of a year market, sort of plus or minus. And historic tax credits, roughly $1 billion a year tax credits. So when you go from a $5 billion round to a $10 billion round, you go from just less than 2 billion in new market tax credits to, just shy of 4 billion in new market tax credits. But, needless to say, investors aren't all the same, and there's different attributes of the different tax credits and all the rest. So I thought it'd be useful for our listeners for you to share some of your insights in terms of discussions you've had with investors about the impact of, this doubling, if you will, of these awards to CDEs. Let me also just caveat all this by saying doubling the awards to CDEs doesn't double the supply of tax credits on that same day. It also function as to how and at what pace CDEs use their awards and are seeking investment from investors. So with that, the predicate, please share your thoughts with our listeners.
Well, I think it leading up into that, you've mentioned all of these different things that can ultimately impact that appetite, and there's plenty of other factors that can really change what that appetite may be. In a vacuum, if all we said is we're going to increase the amount of tax credits and change nothing else, then obviously that would put some downward pressure on pricing. That's just I don't think there's any controversy there. However, I think where there's a difference of opinion in terms of what the world may look like for an investor in 2 years, 3 years, that's really where kind of the discussion with the investors I've spoken to has been interesting. And so each of the different factors that you can talk about the impact of future tax legislation, right? And if the new market tax credit, when it's made permanent, the impact that permanency will have is likely to have a positive impact on pricing. You said it, I think, on our podcast last week when the low-income housing tax credit was made permanent. You saw an increase in tax credit pricing. I think that that knowing that the credit is permanent allows investors to plan for their use of that tax credit in terms of their overall tax equity appetite, right? As you mentioned, it's not just new market tax credits. It's low-income housing, historics, renewable energy, and so forth. So I think, if and when there's permanency, I think that could have a positive impact that may offset some of that downward pressure on pricing that I mentioned. Also, with future legislation, there are changes being proposed that would ultimately increase the investor pool. Well, we didn't talk about that right now, right? Right now, we're talking about is an increase in credits. Well, what if the investor pool increases as well? That increases the demand for those credits, which could offset some of that downward pressure. So I think that, if there are changes made to not only the new market tax credit bill or if parts of the new market tax credit bill are passed, that would increase that, but other changes that may impact it, for example, the general business credit limitation, accounting treatment, there's all kinds of different things that may actually increase the appetite for new market tax credits. And one other uh, item that I would maybe throw out there too is something that you talked about in your Senate Finance Committee hearing is finding ways to or fixing ways to combine it with other incentives. If you can find ways to fix that, pass legislation to fix that or regulations that would help with that, you would have likely a greater appetite for that credit. Another one that is kind of investor specific is CRA and the impact that it will have and the timing of their cycle for their appetite for tax credits may have an impact on that. So it's easy to say that more credits means that there's going to be this downward pressure on pricing. I'm not disagreeing with that, but I also think you can't just focus on that aspect of it. And so, when you factor in all of these other kind of unknowns at this point, just like how a $10 billion round was unknown last year, I think that there's a lot more to consider here and a lot more to unpack in terms of what that ultimate appetite may look like. And we're talking about awards probably not being made till the end of 2025. So this double round of awards really won't hit the street till early 2026. And as you mentioned, it's not like it hits it all at one time. So a lot to kind of to look at. I think it's still a little too early to say, pricing's going to go from an average of 80 cents to 74 cents or something like that. I don't think you can say that. And I wouldn't say that, but I think it's something that we'll continue to talk about. And we're talking about it a lot in the New Market Tax Credit Working Group. And so I envision that we'll continue those discussions.
No, I appreciate your focus on the downward pressure aspect of an increase in supply.
Right.
And that there's so many other factors, it's hard to distill out what impact one factor has relative to all the others. And even the increase in supply, as I noted in terms of the rollout, if theoretically the CDs that got the awards, basically use them at the same pace that they use $5 billion awards, then there's theoretically no increase in supply. It's just,
Right.
it's just the fact that it's sitting at CDEs as opposed to sitting at the CDFI Fund to be awarded. So from that perspective, there wouldn't even be an increase in the supply. It's just a question of who's holding it before it gets used. But if it was all to go out, at a more rapid pace, we expect that it will. And that's one of the reasons why, we were pushing for a combined round. So you can get out and do those high impact, financials, businesses and projects, and there will be this downward pressure in pricing.
And I think that aspect of how quickly it gets invested is also affected by, and we've talked about this, the QEI Quiliqui issuance deadline and when that will be, and whether and the percentage that will be required to be invested by a certain date, as it has in the past. And so, if the CDFI fund, as we've recommended, make some changes to that, I think that would be important in ensuring that there's less downward pressure on tax equity pricing. And so I think that that's, an important aspect that needs to be considered and what will ultimately impact pricing.
Yeah, I do feel like this is a good time for the CDFI Fund to step back from the current approach of having certain minimum usage amounts in order to reapply and provide CDEs a longer window to initially use an allocation. And maybe this kind of primes that pump where we can get the CDFI Fund to allow that longer period of time on a recurring basis. And I think that would be, helpful for CDEs, helpful for businesses to plan. There's a lot of reasons why that sort of additional time would be really useful. I will note to our listeners that Brad did go back and look at the combined round of 15 and 16, where it went from 3.5 million to 7 million, just to see, okay, that was the last time there was this notable change in quote supply. And could we distill impact on equity pricing? And all it did was confirm everything we just said, which is there are so many factors at play that you couldn't readily distill any sort of net result or impact of the credits on equity pricing beyond it created downward pressure. But there were so many other confounding events that sort of net equity pricing you couldn't attribute to the increase in the supply. But you did mention that us, and the us is the Numeric Catastrophe Working Group, making recommendations to the CDFI Fund as to the future, minimum usage requirements for recent allocatees. And that was part of the working group's letter to Treasury in response to the CDFI Fund requesting public comments on the application template, and using that as an opportunity to also make suggestions about the overall allocation process. So if you want to say anything more about key deadlines and the like, and/or other recommendations that the Numeric Catastrophe Working Group made, this is the time to do that. So if you could share some of those that you think would be particularly useful for our audience.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been doing is doing a lot of outreach with members of the Numeric Tax Credit Working Group to understand what are some of the ways that the CFI Fund can make changes that would allow the deployment of $10 billion of allocation to go more smoothly and relieve some of the burdens that currently exist. And the number one response that I received was related to the QEI, quality issuance deadlines, as you mentioned. Currently, if you receive an award, you have to invest a minimum of 20% if you're not a rural CDE in order to be eligible to apply. And there's a deadline for that. Last couple of rounds, it's been 6 months from the date of the award announcement. So, which is not a lot of time to effectively close transactions. And so, as you mentioned, there was a lot of focus in our comments recommending that they change that to 0%, which would make it effectively the same for all CDEs, not just rural CDEs, which would allow them to have at least a year to be able to invest from that most recent award. And so we think that would be a tremendous relief for CDEs. And I think that becomes even more important as you're looking at a $10 billion round. In addition to the QEI quality assurance deadlines, kind of something that we've been hammering for a long time is consistency and transparency in the process. We started this call or the podcast talking about my guesses of timelines, right? And I think that as we've kind of matured, there's definitely a desire that there could be a cycle that is more predictable. Right now, it seems like everything is based upon a season of the year. Right now, if you go on the CDFI Fund's website, it says awards will be made in fall of 2024. That's not really the kind of consistency and transparency that I think everyone is looking for when trying to administer and be good stewards of a program of this size. And that becomes even, more important when you double an allocation round. One of the other areas too, just in terms of transparency, is related to the scoring process. As I mentioned before, scoring has become pretty compressed in terms of the difference in score from the best application to the 100th awardee. There's not that much discrepancy between that. And so we made some recommendations of ways that the CFI Fund could make some changes to their scoring process, changing back to having 3 reviewers and 2, giving there more opportunities for scoring variances, and just overall making it more transparent. But having some of those things and to where it's less of a, once your application is submitted, it goes behind a curtain and you're not sure it's going to happen for 6 months until awards are made or longer. I think that would help the entire process and the efficiency in which, these credits are deployed.
Right. Thank you for that. And as you know, I'm a big fan of transparency. The transparency in the scoring has been something that I've been advocating for, I can't say 24 years. The, the awards weren't first made.
Right.
They were about 20 plus years ago, but
Right.
the notion of more transparency, I'm always toward that. I believe in the value of daylight. But let's now turn to what is perhaps going to be the most practical part of the podcast for listeners, beyond information about how they can plan their holiday schedules and the rest. But if I want to deal with this both from the standpoint of CDEs as well as potential borrowers / investees. So starting with community development entities, if you could share some practical tips as to what CDE should be doing now in preparation for this upcoming $10 billion combined round.
Yeah, happy to. And as we will probably do when the awards are announced, we'll take a deeper dive into this question and have a whole podcast kind of dedicated to that. But to highlight a couple of things. And for CDEs, I break it into two categories, really: new CDEs who've never received an award, and experienced CDEs who have are prior awardees. For new CDEs that have never received an award, haven't maybe gone through the process, maybe even haven't submitted an application before, my biggest piece of advice is become familiar with the application itself. As I mentioned before, you can get a pretty good sense of what the application will look like when it's released based upon what's out there now in the form of the application template and last round's application. There shouldn't be material changes to that for the most part. Knowing what it prioritizes, there's different things that you can figure out will probably ring truer in the application from a scoring perspective. Focusing on the community outcomes within the pipeline that you're developing. We often see community in the 5 sections of the application. More people probably lose out on an award due to their score in their community outcome section. And so I think that is probably one of the most important sections within the application. And so focusing on the types of community outcomes that the CDFI fund is asking about and being able to show that. And then pipeline now is just as good of a time as any to find projects and to start the vetting process for your application. And so I think a lot of that is important for new CDs to kind of appreciate and understand and start putting together. It's also applicable to experienced CDs, but if a CDE has prior allocation, especially recent allocation, there needs to also be a focus on getting as much of that prior allocation invested into qualified businesses. And so as we talked about, there's this QEI and qualified issuance deadline. And if we assume that nothing changes for the next round and the next round after that, you can kind of know exactly how much needs to be closed. And, there's getting that out the door faster. One, you can meet the eligibility requirement, but we also know that the CDFI fund reviews how much allocation you have remaining before they make their final award determination. And that may impact your actual award size. There's should be a continued focus on that. And that will allow you ultimately to get ahead of the QEI deadline. So there may not be as much pressure to close by the same date that everyone else is closing by, and using up the same resources within the industry, the attorneys and accountants and so forth. So starting that process so that it can be less lumpy in terms of, how much allocation is closed within a calendar year, I think can also be helpful. And then we talked about it before, prior awardees will have kind of a greater appreciation for some of the changes in the application template, including the comments to the changes that the Newmark Tax Credit Working Group provided, which can be found online. And so understanding kind of what impact those changes may have, because there were a couple that could have a significant impact. The potential change, these are potential changes, for example, to disadvantaged businesses and communities definition, potentially the addition of a deep distress criteria could have another impact. So understanding these changes all would be important for you to start honing now, because as a prior awardee, you're having to gather information on your prior award pipeline, or prior award closed transactions, as well as your future pipeline. Um, and then most important is to have someone at Novogradac maybe review your prior application and or help you start now on your next application. So I think those are some of the kind of tips I would give to CEs. Um, I think you also mentioned qualified businesses.
Second, just like with CDs for a second,
Sure.
you mentioned a lot of sort of great items, and I just wanted to, maybe put an extra exclamation point on all the data collection you have to have for the application.
Right.
In terms of that's all stuff you can be pulling together now, and there's so much to be done. That's something that is, you're going to need for the whole data collection part. And when you mention the potential pipeline and outcomes, they're so integrated to each other. The whole concept of that pipeline can be time consuming and takes, you can't spend a long weekend line. So from the standpoint of the pipeline, takes lead time and it is iterative with your outcomes and your projected outcomes. So I definitely would be extra emphasis on the data collection, the potential pipeline, as well as you mentioned, spending time reviewing the app and refreshing if you've done it before, refreshing your view and your remembrance of the various questions in the rest. And then if you're doing it for the first time, jumping in and starting to understand the application. But let's now turn to businesses and what potential businesses can be doing now. In a prior podcast and the rest, we've talked about businesses and potential, sponsors of qualified businesses and projects that if they're seeking new market tax credit financing, they should be pulling together basically brag sheets and understanding how the CDFI Fund chooses winners of awards based upon outcomes. And, every business, much like every affordable housing development, every low business seeking to serve a long community is obviously passionate about their business, and they know that their business is going to do great work. But at the same time, they have to be identifying what are the factors that their business will be serving and what outcomes will their business have, and how does that correlate with what the CDFI Fund is seeking to encourage, so that the project sponsor, the business, can be marketing themselves most effectively to CDEs. And oftentimes they're thinking about it when they need the money and going to CDEs with awards. But please share now what they could be doing as part of this next round to get a head start on all of that.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head in that outcomes is a tremendous part. And obviously there's numbers, the financial aspect of it as well. And there should be, that should be clean. However, I think sometimes what's lost is the level of detail related to the outcomes. There is a specific part of the application that anyone can go look at. And I encourage anyone that wants, subsidized new market tax credit financing to know exactly what the categories of community outcomes are, and be able, as you said, to put on a brag sheet, here's how I meet each of those categories, and to what extent. And that will allow CDEs to more easily digest what your project will be able to deliver, and determine, and essentially determine, is this one, one that we are interested in using a portion of our allocation on. CDEs have to make a decision of, they have a limited amount of allocation and which projects they're going to use it on. And so the more information that you can give them that they can then put into their next application to show, as an example of a project that they've invested in, I think that will make the decision for them a little bit easier. I think, understanding too, in reality, when your project can likely close, is also important, in terms of who you're trying to get an allocation from. If your project is ready now, you should be talking to CDEs that you think may receive an award in the next month or so, from the more recent round, but also having those conversations. If your lead time is a little bit longer, with those that will be submitting applications and starting those relationships. You can you can have more than one CDE use your project in their application. So don't be shy to, share your information with multiple CDEs. And then I think, as I mentioned, there is this uh, proposed change to the 2024 application template that I think has a pretty good chance of remaining in the final version when it's released. And that is this definition related to deep distress. So there it is, a definition for what is an eligible census tract for which new market tax credits can be invested in. The CDFI Fund has then said, but we also want you to kind of go deeper, go further into areas that are even more distressed. And so we've had this category referred to as severely distressed, and there's certain parameters around that. In this most recent application template that they put out for public comment, they created another category that goes even further, and they've called it deep distress. And based upon comments that the CDFI Fund made at our June conference in DC, it really does seem like this will probably end up in the application somewhere, somehow. And so it will be a category that I think CDEs who are applying will want to ensure that they're able to identify the projects that reside in these deep distress census tracts. And so one of the things that we have done is updated our new market tax credit mapping tool to allow users to identify what are the deep distress census tracts. And so if you go to our website and navigate to the mapping tool, you'll pop it up and you'll see the familiar yellow and red census tracts, yellow being meets the basic eligibility requirements and red meeting the severely distressed primary criteria. Well, now we have a new category for deep distress, which are purple census tracts. And so you can kind of start to see now, is my project located in a deep distress census tract? Maybe that's something in addition to all the community outcomes I should talk about, because this may become an area that has a heavy focus among CDEs of trying to find projects. So to me, that could be a tip that listeners could use now to kind of get ahead of other qualified projects that may not be aware of the fact that they're in this deep distress criteria, and be able to start talking about that now with CDEs. Lots of different things that both CDEs and qualified businesses can be doing for sure.
Great. Thank you for that. And that's been super helpful. We've covered a lot. Under year 2023 awards announcement, and what our expectations are there. We've obviously talked about the combined allocation round and rough deadlines there and what we might expect from that, both in terms of awardees, average size, as well as businesses financed. And you've also done a good job of sharing with our audience what CDEs and qualified businesses can be doing to prepare for this next allocation round. I will give you a chance to share any last things for our audience.
Well, I thought we were only halfway through, but it sounds like you're wanting to wrap this up. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, just a couple of things. I've mentioned it several times as well. We do have the new market tax credit working group. We would love for those that are interested to reach out and inquire more, and you can find a link on our website to that. There's a lot of benefits. Some of them that I've talked about. The mapping tool that I just mentioned is based upon efforts. As you said, we've advocated for different things on behalf of the new market tax credit industry. We also have some new social media outlets that the working group is sharing its information on. And so you can find us on X and on LinkedIn. We will also host our next in-person meeting at our fall conference in New Orleans on October 25th. And so if you're interested in checking us out in person, feel free to reach out to me as well. And then you'll likely also be seeing a lot of updates to our new market tax credit handbook coming out soon as well. So all great things to check out in addition to everything else that we've talked about on this podcast.
Thank you very much, Brad. I know you're very busy, so I appreciate making time for our audience here today. For our listeners, I will share Brad's contact information in today's show notes, so you can contact him directly with any questions. And we'll also share links to the new market tax credit working group as well as the Novogradac 2024 Fall New Markets Tax Credit Conference, which, as Brad mentioned, is on the 24th and 25th in New Orleans. And before we get to our off-mic section, I did want to, as I do every week, remind our listeners and viewers, please subscribe to our podcast on whatever platform you prefer. And also, please do share the podcast with your colleagues who may be interested in listening to the podcast. We do have quite a library of podcasts over the years. So it's a great source of binge listening and binge watching to get up to speed on a number of tax credit matters. And please also, if you have a moment, leave a review of the podcast on your platform of choice. Now, I wanted to quickly turn to the off-mic section, which has certainly turned into a very fun segment where we get to acknowledge our industry colleagues. So, Brad, please share an industry shout out for the week.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. And because we have mentioned the New Market Tax Credit Working Group so much on this podcast, my shout out is to all the members in the New Market Tax Credit Working Group, because it's without their membership, we wouldn't be able to accomplish a lot of the things that we have over the last 20 plus years. And I think that, with their input and their participation in that discussion, we've been able to do a lot of good. And so my shout out is to all the nearly 80 members of the working group. So thank you all for everything and your support of what we're doing.
Great. I'll echo your shout out and give a shout out to you as well and all your leadership with the New Market Tax Credit Working Group. So thank you, Brad. And to our listeners, I'm Mike Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.